Do you love books but don't have time to read them? Do you wish you could listen to your favorite stories while driving, working out, or doing chores? If so, you need Audible, the world's largest library of audiobooks and podcasts. With Audible, you can enjoy unlimited access to thousands of titles across genres and categories from bestsellers to classics, thrillers, romance, fiction, and nonfiction. You can also discover new and exclusive content from Audible Originals, featuring original stories and performances by celebrities and authors. Plus, you can download your audiobooks and podcasts offline for listening anywhere, anytime, on any device. And with Audible Plus, you can get even more benefits, such as unlimited listening to select audiobooks and podcasts, free exchanges and returns, and a 30-day free trial. So what are you waiting for? Join Audible today and start your listening adventure. Visit the show notes to support the show and get your free Audible trial today. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
Gentlemen, what's a piece of pop culture that isn't popular anymore, but you still love?
Pull back the curtain. Before we got on mic, Tom was relaying to me how he couldn't think of something that's was once popular, is now out of fashion, that he still loves. And the majority of my interests are things that were once popular and now out of fashion. I often like to joke that I'm up to date on all of the most popular books and movies of the late 1800s. But I think, the two that come to mind, I almost want to say The Lone Ranger, which I'm a big fan of The Lone Ranger. But that did at least get a movie in 2013. Wasn't popular, but at least had a movie. Some people might be vaguely aware of it. So my answer is going to be something a little more... Again, it was hugely significant, isn't anymore, and I actually have some memorabilia sitting on my desk. I was just away at an antique store and picked up an old antique mug celebrating Davy Crockett during America's Davy Crockett craze. I mean, it is impossible to overstate how much little kids of like the 50s and on had like the raccoon skin cap and all knew who Davy Crockett was. And now you couldn't ask a person who the hell that is. Like, you go to Disneyland now, they've still got like their Davy Crockett canoes, but there's no child who knows what that is. There's no kids today who are excited by Davy Crockett or any of the old like pioneer stories. I guess it ties into the broader unpopularity of things like the Western and things like that. But for me, Davy Crockett, I think the entire Crockett phenomenon of the 50s, I really enjoy those Bess Parker films and the song, and I have a bunch of the Davy Crockett memorabilia because it's just kind of fun, but not something that's playing to the TikTok crowd, I think.
So thinking specifically, I think once I started thinking in like specific property or a specific movie, it kind of came to me quickly because it's always crazy to think about this, that this movie was the number 2 movie of its year. And it was huge, popular, kickstarted a whole little subgenre of pictures in the late 70s, early 80s. And they just don't exist anymore. Like, they're not made, they're not talked about. And film fans talk about this movie because it's a perfect movie. Everybody loves it, but it's not a thing that's in the public conscious anymore. People don't talk about it as inspirations for their movie. Even when people are doing car chase stuff now, like McQuarrie talking about Dead Reckoning this summer, it's talking about like Friedkin or like The General or whatever. Like, they're talking about other stuff. They're not talking about this movie. But Smokey and the Bandit's one of my favorite fucking movies of all time. It is literally, the theme song is my ringtone. A specific Burt Reynolds laugh from that movie is my text message noise. It was the number 2 movie of 1977. Only beaten by Star Wars. And that's like, oh, well, obviously he was going to get beaten by Star Wars, but like, neither of those 2 movies were like anybody thought anything was going to be. Like, nobody really talks about it now. Nobody thought Star Wars was going to be shit when it came out. Everyone was like, oh, it's a bad movie. Like, it's whatever. It's not sci-fi, blah, blah. And this fucking movie about Burt Reynolds bootlegging beer and just chuckling with Jackie Gleason. Like, who thought that would have been a fucking hit? But no, it's the number 2 movie of 1977. Huge hit. Beats Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like, what the fuck? A Burt Reynolds goddamn movie beats a fucking Steven Spielberg movie. Like, it beat a James Bond. Like, that shouldn't have happened. Saturday Night Fever is a movie people still talk about, and that got beaten by Smokey and the Bandit. So yeah, Smoking the Bandit's my answer. It's a masterpiece of dopey cinema, but nobody talks about it anymore, sadly.
Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we're joined by author Philip Womack as we discuss the 1937 adaptation of The Prisoner of Zenda.
Our guest today is the author of several books for children and young people, including most recently Wild Lord, out in the U.S. this year, and Ghost Lord, which is out next year. He's also written a book for adults, a lighthearted introduction to the Greeks and the Romans, called How to Teach Classics to Your Dog. It is not an instruction manual for teaching Latin to your pet. Philip Womack joins us today to discuss The Prisoner of Zenda. Philip, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Pleasure's all ours, man. Just gotta say, little upset it's not a manual for teaching Latin to your pet. My dog knows a lot of French, but in the way of pardon my French, my dog knows a lot of curse words. I was gonna try to figure out some Latin, get her prepared for the new Exorcist movie in October. She needs to know exactly when I finally do get possessed by the devil, she needs to know how to get me out of that whole thing.
But I did manage to teach my dog how to come and sit in Latin, so
really?
Which is in the book, so it is possible.
I mean, there's the number one endorsement right there. If you can,
Listen, if dogs approve, I'm good with it. Yeah, this is a pro dog podcast, by the way, people. So if dogs are for it, we're for it.
We're so excited to have you here, Philip. I mean, obviously, you are, in addition to your writing work, you are, as you can find if people Google it, a foremost advocate for this, the Prisoner of Zenda and the Anthony Hope novel. I know it has been a huge influence on you as an author. And as we were sitting down to talk about how to discuss this film and its impact, I think it is one of those very interesting things where you made a great case in an article you wrote about why people should still rediscover this novel. And that I found was a very stirring argument in favor of this. And, when we do this podcast, part of the reason we chose the National Film Registry, from the Library of Congress, as opposed to one of those greatest films lists, is that it's a much more concerted effort to preserve all aspects of American cinematic culture in so many regards. So you will come across titles that aren't necessarily playing on television all the time anymore or anything like that, but are hugely important and hugely influential for a period of time, and an effort to preserve that. So I think that since the mission of the Library of Congress's National Film Registry is to go let's preserve these important and influential works, even if they aren't talked about quite as much as some of the newer things that have come along. So too was kind of your argument in favor of Anthony Hope's novel and the several adaptations that have come since. Maybe not all of them. Let's not defend all the adaptations. I watched the 50s remake, and it's a rough watch, is all I'm saying. But I really wanted to make sure, we had you here to really kind of discuss that. So
no, it's great. I mean, the Prisoner of Zenda, as you say, it was a great influence and on my writing. But I think we're very, very lucky because as a novel, it's been preserved culturally. It's a very light-hearted novel. It's a very ironic novel, but it has a lot of deeper, darker undercurrents, which I think people have picked up now over the years. If you look at what's happening at the time, you're just at the beginning of modernism, and you're getting into more interesting things happening in terms of plot and breaking up stories and fragments and all that sort of thing. And this obsession with identity and the double and the doppelganger and the idea that you have a kind of dark other self that exists somewhere else and that somehow you have to acknowledge that self in order to be a person. And that's definitely at the heart of The Prisoner of Zenda, because you've got lots of different kinds of doubles in the book. You've got Rudolph himself, who is a physical double of the king. And then you have the fantastic Rupert of Hentzau, who is possibly the best villain that ever existed. He's dashing, he's handsome, but he's also evil. He's properly evil, but he does it. Well, like the devil. The devil is a gentleman. Rupert of Hentzau is a gentleman, but Rupert is also a double of Rudolph. The names are quite similar, but also as Rudolf Rassendyll, as he gets into the role of the action hero, he begins to exult in violence, which places him quite near to Rupert of Hentzau himself. So there's not that much difference between them. It can be a bit of a cliche. It's like the hero and the villain staring across at each other. We are not so different, you and I. But there is a lot to be said for that. And what distinguishes Rudolph and Rupert is that Rupert is corrupt. Is completely corrupt, whereas Rudolph is brave, he's noble, he's honest, and I think those qualities are what makes it survive, because this is a world where good is good and evil is evil. So I think the novel is framed really interestingly because it begins with this kind of drawing room comedy where Rudolf Rassendyll is talking to his sister-in-law, and she's sort of teasing him and says, well, you haven't got a job, you're completely useless. So there's actually some sort of social commentary going on there about the upper classes. And Anthony Hope was actually a liberal politician, and he stood unsuccessfully as a candidate as an MP. So there's a lot of that going on as well. There is a kind of critique of society happening at the same time as all the adventure stuff. So you start with this rather safe world, rather boring world, which is distinct from the film, actually, which we can talk about later. And then he gets on a train, which is a symbol of modernity, and then he gets off it, and he's gone back into the past. And because if you look at Ruritania, they have guns, but they don't really use them. They seem to be more like peasants. They're very backward. It really does feel as if you've moved back to the beginning of the 19th century. So it's got that kind of framework that you're shifting back into a time where things were starker and clearer, where things were more obviously easy to deal with. So anybody can read that story and think, yes, I understand that Rupert is bad and Rudolph is good, and anybody can enjoy that. So that's the sort of, I suppose you might call it the meta narrative above it. And then, of course, it's the story itself, which is just fantastic. It's so clever. Okay, it rests on silly coincidences and all that sort of thing, but ultimately, who cares when it's it's so gripping. I think I read it first when I was maybe 11 years old, and I just couldn't put it down. It was absolutely gripped, particularly towards the end as they go to the castle of Zenda, and that bit where they attack it, and then there's the duel, is just magic. And I think that there's also part of the appeal, certainly for me as well, aside from the sort of darker, weird stuff. I think I said in the article, I'm amazed that the Freudians haven't got hold of this yet, and I haven't seen a Freudian reading of it. Perhaps I'm too lazy to do it myself, but perhaps someone out there could manage it. But aside from all that dark stuff, there is the pureness and the goodness of Rudolf Rassendyll, and the fact that he doesn't get the girl, he gets nothing at the end. He's done all this stuff. He's impersonated the king. He's been the king. He's rescued the king. And then he gets nothing for his pains. Not a pension, not a penny, nothing at all. He can't even contact Flavia. And actually, when I read it the last time for this article, I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried at the end because, like, as a child, I was like, oh, it's so lame. Because what happens at the end is that Rudolph, who's properly in love with Flavia, who's the princess of Ruritania, and she's properly in love with him, and she does her duty because she's a royal. Some other royals might like to listen to this. Gingerhaired princes. See, it's still current, right? So Princess Flavia does her duty. She marries the king because she has to be the queen. Therefore, eschewing a life of modernity with Rudolf Rassendyll. But every year she goes to Dresden. She sends Fritz with a white rose. I think it's a white rose, a rose that symbolizes Zenda, and gives it in a box to Rudolf, who picks it up, and he sends one back. and it's just so lovely and romantic, and even a hard-bitten cynic like me can can sort of find something in that purity. So it's got all these things working together, and there's more going on, which if we have time to talk about, we can discuss.
And we should note, we're going to talk more about the film specifically in a bit after I read the statement, but it's interesting, you mentioned the rose, because I read, when I knew we were doing this, I read the Anthony Hope novel.
Yes.
Which really is great. It's really gripping. It's it's well worth reading. But you're right. There's that ending. There's that extra ending. In a way, it's the extra ending of the book, that there's the element of Flavia sending him the rose and him sending the rose back, which of course factors into the novel's sequel, Rupert of Hentzau.
Yes. Yep.
But what's interesting that I didn't know, they don't include that in the 37 film.
Yes, exactly.
However, they filmed something involving the roses that is even darker, and they cut it. The original ending that they shot was him back home, and you didn't see him receiving the many roses from Flavia. Instead, you saw him receiving the last rose, implying that she had died.
Oh no.
And the studio basically went, no. It's so funny, because you mentioned like how sad the ending of the novel is, and it is, but it's sad in that bittersweet, like, guy walking away at the end of Streets of Fire or My Darling Clementine kind of thing. And then apparently Selznick initially had been like, well, what's going to really send everybody home with a smile? She's dead. Like, oh my God. You mentioned reading this for the first time when you were 11.
Yeah.
I will say the first time it came on my radar, Prisoner of Zenda, and there could also be different things in terms of, like, you were talking about, the connection to royalty. Like, obviously, we're growing up in suburban New York. We don't exactly, the most prominent king we have here is Burger. So,
well-known dynasty.
But it came on my radar because, I think people who, and I've actually mentioned Zenda before on a previous season, it was one of those things where once I found out about it, there's so much stuff from like the first half of the 20th century that so references it.
Yes.
That once you learn about Prisoner of Zenda and how big it was in its day and how ubiquitous it was, that for the first half of the 20th century, Rupert of Hentzau was like Darth Vader, where you could reference it. And people were, it's like we talk about it with, a lot of old silent films we watch reference Simon Legree from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not a novel that's read much anymore, but like it was secondhand, it was just like people knew who Rupert was. They knew this thing. I first found Zenda because I was reading Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov.
Yeah, well, that's
and obviously the meta narrative throughout Pale Fire is this guy doing the footnotes claiming he was a prince from the kingdom of Zembla. And, my first time reading it, I just took it at face value, right? I guess anyone does the first time you're reading it, like, I guess this guy's telling the truth. And then when you learn about Prisoner of Zenda and you go, oh, he's just making up, in theory, making up things that he saw on the movies, right? And the big screen. And then that's when I had read up on Zenda, and then you start seeing it in everything. I mean, we talked about it last season. Duck Soup by the Marx Brothers is a takeoff on the Ruritanian romance. Fredonia is a lampooning of the Ruritanian romance. They look like Ruritanians, except instead of it being Rudolph stepping into the role of leader and doing it the honorable way, it's Groucho Marx, and he breaks the entire country. And they have, once you know that, and once you've seen Zenda or read Zenda, and you realize like the woman in Duck Soup is a spoof of Flavia, and you start to see these little connections here and there. It's very, it was so crucial to culture.
Well, exactly, and it was a massive bestseller. I mean, it's very galling for someone like me who's now over 40 to Anthony Hope Hawkins was 31 when he wrote it, and it took him a month to write. 1 month. And there's a couple of stories about what inspired him to do it, and some people think that he saw the resemblance between the king at the time, George, and his cousin Tsar Nicholas, who looked very, very similar. But he got this idea. He went off and wrote it, and it was an almost instant bestseller. And for years, for many, many years, it carried on in print. It spawned games. It spawned many theatre adaptations, which were very, very successful. And in fact, to slightly sidetrack, there's a lovely connection with the film, is that the person who plays Zapt, who's sapped in the book, in the 37 Selznick production, he played Rupert of Hentzau in an 1897 theatre production. So you've got this kind of nice doubling going on there. But yeah, it was this enormous bestseller. He himself wrote more Ruritanian books that came afterwards. I can't remember the names of all of them, but there's at least 30 of them. And then, of course, even in his lifetime, people were imitating it. So even by the time of the film, it had been spoofed many, many times. And that, I think, actually is what the film does really well, is it treads the line between spoof and playing it straight very, very nicely, and very, very, it never kind of wavers. But yes, it's central to a certain kind of way of looking at the world. There's, The Princess Bride is one of my favorite films, which obviously you all grew up in. I mean, you say, Zenda, you had, growing up in the American suburbs, me growing up in England, and you've got The Princess Bride and all these Americans in it. So, it's kind of different experience, but the cultural influence that it had and still has is enormous. It's vast, and it was picked up in India. It's been picked up across the world.
Yeah, I did. I didn't get a chance to. I was trying to track it down, the Indian cinema adaptation of Zenda. There's also a Peter Sellers version.
Yes,
that I was trying desperately to find. That sounds like it would be a hoot. But I did watch the '50s version, and I have to say it. You read James Mason as Rupert of Hentzau, and you go, well, this is going to be a banger. This is going to be a hoot. And instead, you're like, I don't know what happened here. Why did we lose all the energy? But the 37 one definitely has it. Now, we're talking about when we first came to Zenda. Now, I'm going out on a limb here. I'm assuming, Tom, that you were unfamiliar with this story in this film before you saw it. But I think unless I'm wrong, but I would have to imagine, especially somebody like yourself who is so into blockbusters and action films and adventure films and things like that. Like I have to imagine, like, as you were watching it, I think you were sort of feeling like you had seen all of the things that were in it.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, I never saw it before until I watched it for this. And I think this is a thing we'll talk about in the episode, its place in pop culture, but like I never even heard of it before. Like, it's one of those movies where it influenced so much stuff, but we just don't talk about it much anymore, which is, it's a shame. I wish it would get like a nice Blu-ray release, because I love those old, like it just had, like I said to Mike in a text, it looks like there are moments and bits where it feels like an old Universal horror movie. The way the sets are lit, like there's one set where it looks like the staircase from Son of Frankenstein, the foyer from that movie. Yeah, never heard of it. So I went in blind, because I like doing that. If I don't know anything when I'm doing something for the show, I like to just go in and see what it is before I do any research. And yeah, I was really just like, and even now, like like we talk about it, other things just keep coming into your mind of what was influenced by it. Like, I mean, maybe the biggest one I think in my head is one that I cannot pick as my pick for the National Film Registry this episode, because it's Japanese, but Kagemusha. I mean, there's no way Kurosawa did not see and love this movie. I read a biography about it. I read his biography where he's like, yeah, when I was a kid, we'd go to, I forget the town, but we'd go a few towns over and see the American movies that were playing. And he was a kid when this came out. He definitely saw Prisoner of Zenda, and he definitely loved it. I mean, he's probably the best sword fight director of all time. I mean, how many movies has he made where people fight with swords, and then he makes this big epic? Oh, Kagemusha's so fucking good. Guys, watch Kagemusha.
To your point, Tom, talking about the sword fight specifically,
Yes.
right? Like, I just want to touch on that real quick. Like, I grew up on a lot of those Errol Flynn movies. and the the Captain Blood and all of those. So I've seen plenty of old film sword fights. And I read the Anthony Hope book before I watched the film. And as you were discussing, Philip, that attack on the castle is so fun in the book to read and to imagine. And so often when you're watching a literary adaptation, especially in this time, the stuff you're imagining in your head doesn't quite, kind of beats out whatever they put on screen. But I have to say, that showdown is one of my favorite, like, black and white cinema sword fights. It's so great. Fairbanks Jr. especially just sells the hell out of it, and that. Yeah, I mean, that is, so I just wanted to say, like, to your point, I'm like, that is absolutely, you look at that and that feels like, in some senses, the way some people talk about the car chase in Bullet. You know what I mean? Where you're just like, oh, surely,
It's just shot so perfectly. Like,
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like, it's with the shadows and everything, and just the playful way, but that there's also a sense of danger to it. I mean, it helps that prior to that fight, a guy just got, was impaled by the sword. Where so you go like, oh, there, like, people will die in this movie. Like, this is not like, oh, we're gonna soft play everything. It's no, this one of these guys is gonna die. But then they don't, because Douglas Fairbanks. I just love that he's just like, see you later, asshole, and just jumps out the window.
That's one of the best bits in the film, isn't it?
It's great because it's just so not like the typical like 3-act save the cat kind of structure you expect from Hollywood movies, especially of that time, where it's just very much like, the movies could be good, but there was a bit of these are product ideas to them. Like, oh, people want to see what they like. They don't change up the formula. So for him to just see you later, dickhead, and just leave, and then you're like, are they gonna like say like right before the movie ends, oh, we caught him and hung him? It's just no, he's gone. Like, he's just gone. Love that. Awesome. The best part of the movie, and they're like, yeah, he's gonna get away. And I mean, because Fairbanks is the best part of the movie, in my opinion. And I just love that it's like, oh, he is just the biggest rancid asshole but he's charming. And then he gets away. Like, nothing really good comes out of like almost anything in this movie. It's kind of just like a lot of furor for, all right, well, the drunk's still gonna be king. The bad guy that was like, he just killed his boss, and then he just runs away.
Well, it's interesting. I've got lots of things to pick up on there, but one, what you just said, that nothing changes, and that I almost, reading it again, I almost thought it's sort of a dream, because in the novel he's asleep and he wakes up, and then the king's there. It's very dreamlike, and it's almost as if actually you could read the whole thing as a dream, and then he goes back to his life as it was, and it's sort of a little bit uncertain. But I was interested in your horror point, because I think you're right, and absolutely that really gothic castle and the shadowy things, and I think there's a lot of that going on there as well. And I think one of the things people tend not to notice about Zenda is that it's actually terrifying, because like the king is bound and gagged in a cellar while somebody else impersonates him, and if that's not the most terrifying thing that you could. I don't know if you've ever heard of a novel called The Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. It's an 18th century novel, if maybe I forget the date, but it's a Scottish novel, and it's about this idea of the fetch, or the double. And this guy starts seeing himself, but the double is committing crimes, and so he has to kind of stop that. So it's that idea that something out there is impersonating you and living your life, which is like, that's also the root of a lot of horror.
And just, I mean, even beyond like, oh, we see the king bound up and captured and whatever. It's like, no, Douglas Fairbanks comes in and it's just like, oh, by the way, if anyone comes to try to rescue you, we are going to throw you down this goddamn hole and you're going to drown. And it's just like, oh, like, I think that's one of the, because it's not immediately apparent, but one of the things that's very striking about this movie is the tone of it, because it starts very charming and kind of comedic and light, and then it shifts almost like imperceptibly on a dime, just like, oh no, like this is heavy shit. Like, they're trying to kill the king. They're trying to overthrow the nation. They're going to instill martial law to control the populace. you're just like, whoa, this is not the lighthearted escapade you think it's going to be. Like, people are going to, like, lives are on the line here, and not just the kings. Like, an entire country is, which is also really, like, was something, like, something had to have been in the air for this to come out
Well,
4 years before America gets into the war. Like, that's really crazy. Like, they knew, because Douglas Fairbanks is very Nazi-esque in this movie. Like, so they even if we, quote unquote, didn't know everything in 1937, they must have knew enough to be like, I think we need to lean into this German bad guy thing, because I think we're going to be talking about them in a little bit.
Yeah,
it's very
interesting.
Very calls their shot.
When the book was written, it wasn't that far off 1848. Well, it was 50 years off, but there or thereabouts. But all the revolutions that had taken place across Europe, so that's definitely in the air. And Black Michael is almost a revolutionary figure himself, because he's got the support of the populace. It's the slum dwellers in the novel who support him. You don't get that so much in the film. I think they sort of slightly elide that, or they don't really show it. But yeah, there is that sense of, like, there's definitely political turmoil about to happen, and it is really, really real and really dangerous. And I think you're right too, about, because people often forget, like, Ruritania is now associated with the Balkans, but it's actually Ruritania is German.
Yeah.
In the novel, he speaks fluent German, which is one of the things. Like, in the novel, you can get away with it, but in the film, it's like, oh, this Englishman turns up in where, and he can talk. What? Nobody's like. So that's the one thing that the film has. You have to sort of slightly, take on the chin. But yeah, I think you're right about the historical aspects of it too.
So before we go any further, as we're dipping into the film talk, I want to read. We've said what we thought of Prisoner of Zenda. Let's talk about what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry said about The Prisoner of Zenda. A romantic adventure from David O. Selznick, The Prisoner of Zenda harkens back to a time of chivalry and swordplay. Anthony Hope's 1894 novel served as the basis for this and as many as 5 other filmed interpretations. When an Englishman, Ronald Colman, tours a small kingdom, he is discovered to bear a striking resemblance to that country's royal family, placing Colman in a dual role amid the tangled tale of mistaken identity. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. portrays the scoundrel bent on exposing the charade. Madeline Carroll is the king's regal fiancée, and Raymond Massey plays the king's evil brother. Selznick banked on the film's escapist charm and capitalized on the world's fascination with the 1936 abdication of Edward VIII of England, who gave up his throne to marry a commoner. His instinct proved right, and the production was a box office success. So I think that's such an interesting point that they make, too. As you mentioned, Philip, when Anthony Hope is writing the novel, the fixation is on the current king of the time and his similarity to the Tsar and all of that, which, as far as I know, never became a huge issue at any point. Definitely not.
I don't think they stood in for each other, although it'd be quite funny if they did.
Well, I was thinking about that as I was rewatching it the last time, is just imagining, you guys just had a new coronation recently. Just imagining if, like, out of the blue, like, Edward decided to stop building sets for the theater and was like, what if I knocked my brother out and then an imposter took over? Like, I don't see it happening. But they make the point that, like, that Selznick does that because of the fascination with Edward, which is also its own thing of, weirdly, the way that Anthony Hope wrote about Ruritania, right? And this, as you mentioned, like, it's the start of modernity, right? And romanticizing these other countries' monarchies is, in a way, kind of something that we here in the States and we in Hollywood still do with the English royalty and the English royal family. We are still, believe me, as a person who works sometimes as a journalist who has to cover these things, I promise you that coronation drove so many clicks. We care about everything all the way down to the grandkids. You write an article going, what George is doing for his birthday, and people show up. So we kind of, weirdly, we in Hollywood and in America do that with the British royal family. So it's kind of interesting to see, when you look at this 37 version, how it's taking Anthony Hope's kind of European romanticism for, as you said, Germany and the Balkans and any of that kind of that era and his version of modernity entering in. And at the same time, now here we are in 37, because there's earlier versions of Zenda on film. William Dixon, who did The Great Train Robbery, made a silent version. There was a 1922 silent version, but this is the one that really feels like it taps into more than just escapism. And I thought it was very nice that, because it's easy to mistake this as just escapism, but I love that they called it a romantic adventure. Prisoner of Zenda, both the novel and the film, is a romance in the older sense of how we describe a romance. Now we take it to just mean a story where people fall in love, but no, it is a romance in the much broader, more sweeping sense, and I think that comes through in this particular film.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And well, you're right. You're absolutely right that the romance, the original romance, meant a novel, basically, and the original romances were Greek stories. And they had these kinds of plots with like lost twins, and you get that in Shakespeare, and people doubling up. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a good point.
Well, yeah, it's just it is interesting that, because again, I wouldn't have expected this to be the case going into the movie, but it all really does revolve around romance, which, I mean, your main guy is conflicted about, I mean, maybe I should just keep being the king so I can marry Flavia because I do actually love her, but oh no, I should do the right thing and I'll try to get her. And then you have Douglas Fairbanks. He's really just doing all of this. Well, one, because he's an asshole. I mean, the movie kind of goes out of its right. He's just doing it because he just wants to, and he can. But also, he doesn't want Michael to get the girl. He wants the girl that Michael's got. So it's like, all right, well, let's get rid of Michael, and that way I have a better chance with the girl. And it's like, well, no, dumbass. She's not going to go with you if you kill her, the guy she's in love with. So it is interesting that all of this political upheaval basically kind of just falls apart because two guys love women. Yes. It's like Mike said, it's an older version of romance and not just like. And I just like the honesty of the ending, where he doesn't get the girl, not because she doesn't love him, but because she's quote unquote doing the right thing.
Yes.
It almost makes it not makes up for, but the fact that the real king is like, oh, I'm going to be a good man now. You showed me how to be a real king, and I just go, nah, you in real life you would never change. You would have like a week. You would have a week where you're like, I'm gonna try to be a good man, and then the first time like anything bad happens in the country, you're just like, get me the nearest bottle of wine. I need to get fucking drunk.
Well,
I cannot deal with these goddamn peasants.
Spoilers, Tom, for Rupert of Hentzau, the sequel novel, which starts out with the narrator going, King's drinking again. Flavia hates him. She's really unhappy.
I knew it. Yes. There you go. But like it. So there's a little bit of a false point to that in the movie. So to have it really actually end on the not deterioration, but the unfulfilled romance helps it end on a more truer note than because it really does boil down to the love. You would think it would end with the king stuff, but it doesn't. So I like that structural and kind of like knowing exactly what the juice is. Like this is what the movie is, more so than political schemings. It's about a guy who likes a girl.
Yeah, and can't get her.
Yeah, I mean, hey, relatable.
I was just saying that the ending is an interesting thing because it, as a plot structure, it kind of eats itself because you can't. There essentially is no ending because they can't. Once you've got two people who are doubles of each other, then they can't impersonate each other again unless the situation is removed to a different place. So you couldn't have him impersonating. You couldn't have Rudolf Rassendyll impersonating the king forever, because that would just be wrong. And so he gets around it by killing both of them, which again in the sequel, Rupert of Hentzau, both are killed, and they end up burning the king's body and then burying Rudolf Rassendyll as the king. So there's a kind of terrible. Again, there's a kind of horror there. There's a horror element there as well.
Oh, it's an even darker book
Yeah.
than Prisoner of Zenda, I would argue. Like,
and then Flavia wins out, in the end.
With Rupert of Hentzau, by the way, I mean, because there is this thing. Before I read the novel and before I saw the film, when I was just researching it, and I came across like, oh, there's The Prisoner of Zenda, and then there was a sequel called Rupert of Hentzau. When you haven't read it and you haven't seen it, strikes you a bit odd because you're like, well, because according to the summary, this guy is just like a secondary character, But then you read it, and just reading it alone, this guy brings such an energy. This character is such a scoundrel that you're like, but a lovable scoundrel. I mean, the closest comparison I could think of for our listeners is I really think for its time, and Philip, I apologize that I'm going to compare this, compare the Prisoner to like the popular fare of today and possibly sound like I'm, in the swine pits, but to make it the comparison, it really feels akin to what happened after that first Thor movie came out. And Tom Hiddleston's Loki, who is supposed to be the villain, but like a secondary villain. But a couple things happened. One, really engaging character. Two, every girl at New York Comic-Con got up to the microphone to ask him questions because he's very attractive. So Marvel very wisely went, keep this guy around. Not only are we keeping him around, screw it. I don't care that we killed him in the movies. He's getting his own series anyway. And I do think that, like, when you watch, especially in 37, when you watch Fairbanks Jr. as Rupert of Hentzau, right? He is, I mean, it is this thing. I talked about it in our first season when we talked about, when we watched, my partner and I watched Gone with the Wind, and she's not a big old Hollywood person. She saw, my God, how did I just forget his name? Gone with the Wind, lead actor. Somebody help me here.
Clark Gable?
Clark Gable, thank you. She saw Clark Gable for the first time and went, who the hell is that? And I do think, like, weirdly, even though he's not supposed to be the lead, even though, in theory, the most appealing guy in your movie should be Ronald Colman, he should be the handsome one, the minute Fairbanks comes on screen, he looks so different from the rest of them. His hair, the mustache, everything, that you can't help but go, who the hell is this guy? Like, this guy's got something.
This is as like the teapot said in Beauty and the Beast, a tale as old as time.
Yeah,
because you've got the attractive power of evil, and this is the problem Milton had in Paradise Lost, where Satan gets all the best lines. And Satan is a much more interesting character than Adam. He's sort of a bit boring and a bit dull, and but with Satan has these terrible kind of tortured thoughts, and he's like a sort of tragic hero, and it's the same kind of thing with Rupert of Hentzau, and it was interesting that actually from the swine pits, as you say, but I think it's a valid point, because Loki is a trickster, and he's the trickster archetype, and it's a similar sort of thing. It's like the kind of Rupert of Hentzau is that kind of person. He's the disruptor. He's got energy, and quite often that person has more energy than the hero, because heroes tend to be kind of reactive. They tend to react against stuff, whereas it's the villains who tend to do stuff that forces so you're kind of quite often blown away. Villains can be very creative. They can be more creative than the kind of do-gooding heroes. So that's and I can definitely see that Loki is a more interesting character than Thor, because like, what can Thor do? I mean, hands up, I haven't watched them, so but I would imagine that in the film Thor doesn't do very much other than kind of wave a hammer around.
It's also the fact that he's a secondary villain, right? Like, he's not, Black Michael is our main villain, and what's fun about Rupert in a way, and I think what allows him to be appealing, is that, and kind of sexy and all that stuff, is the fact that he's not our main antagonist, right? He's not Black Michael. He could just as easily kill Rudolph or Black Michael, right? You don't really know. It's kind of like, I was thinking about this when I was watching it. This is maybe, again, a silly comparison, but to bring it to something else from recently, not that recently, I'm going to feel old saying recently doing this, but if you remember when they brought back Doctor Who, during the Chris Eccleston years, right? And they who the Doctor's companion is always a big thing. But when they brought in Captain Jack.
Oh,
They brought in
yes.
Jack Harkness, and he kind of, I mean, obviously he's not a villain, but they give him the same kind of roguish swagger
Mhm.
of, and much like Rupert, which I kind of love about Rupert, is that, especially the way Fairbanks plays him, is that yes, Tom's right. Rupert is trying to romance Black Michael's lover, but also you get the sense that Rupert would romance just about anybody at any
Mhm.
point in the film just for kicks.
Yeah.
And that's what they bring to Captain Jack and Doctor Who, and that's what happens with so many of these. Yes, he's a villain because he's killing people, but he's also just kind of a rogue. And I
Mm.
think that's what adds to his appeal.
Well, that's the
Is-
thing. He's the only one in the well, not the only one, but he's having so much fun. He's playing a game of life and death, and the only time you really see him break from his chaotic jester persona is when he tries to get oh god, I keep doing this. Rudolph, is it Rudolph is the one pretending to be king?
Yeah,
Yes,
they're both Rudolph. Yeah.
they all have
Yeah.
R names. It's confusing. I understand.
And also I'm a moron, so forgive me. But when he's like trying to, they're in the cabin, and he's trying to get Rudolph to be like, hey, like, why don't we just like keep this whole thing going, and you can be the king, and I'll get rid of Michael, and you just give me all of Michael's shit. And then Rudolph is like, hey, guess what this asshole's trying to do? And he's just like, you motherfucker. And he gets pissed off, and he throws the knife at him, and you're like, oh, that's the only. But otherwise, he's having fun. He's just like slinking around, being like, hey, like, and the whole movie doesn't happen if it's not for him.
Yeah.
Because Michael poisons his brother, but it's not until he tells Rupert, go check on what fucking happened, because I'm looking at my brother, what happened, that he's like, oh yeah, I found your brother, I kidnapped him, like, yeah, we're gonna do this whole thing, like, it'll be fine. If it wasn't for Rupert, he's the one who comes up with everything. Michael's kind of pretending like he's the boss here. If it wasn't for Rupert, Michael would kind of be up shit's creek without a paddle.
Well, that's something Philip brought up at the beginning, talking about the parallels, right?
Yeah.
Is that, in a sense, yes, you're right. Black Michael intends to poison his brother, but there is something about, and Philip, as you acknowledge, like the way the book starts has the framing device of him basically telling you, like, I'm just a layabout here over in, my sister's on me to get a job. I took this sojourn. And the novel also spends like the early chunk explaining the entire connection between these families and why they look alike, which is I do kind of love with the 37 film when he arrives at the train station. If you haven't read the book and you don't know the story,
Like
when
me.
he shows up and everybody's just looking at him like, you look like the king. You're like, what a cool thing to imagine, just showing up somewhere and them going, you look a lot like the guy who runs this place. It's a great little effect. But with Rupert, and I just want to say with Rupert, watching the 50s version with James Mason, because they used in the 50s version, they used pretty much the same script, and it is remade almost shot for shot. The framing's the same and everything. But when Mason is playing Rupert and he calls Rudolph play actor, he does it scornfully, right? He does it looking down on him. He's saying, you imposter. What I love about Fairbanks's take on Rupert is that when he says play actor, it sounds almost like there's a little bit of appreciativeness to it. There's a little bit of like, there's a little bit of game recognized game in this one, in a way of, because Rupert is not the king, he's not Black Michael. He's essentially being like, hey man, listen, we gotta, guys like us gotta stick together. Like, I get I get it. Bro, if I looked like a king, I'd be doing exactly what you're doing right now. I respect it. I'm sorry we're on opposite sides of this, but like, I respect it, which I think is such a great dynamic.
Exactly. But exactly, because it's the kind of mad escapade that Rupert would do, and do really well. And of course, Rupert would kill the actual king and pretend to be him. But yeah, that's the difference, isn't it, between them?
Mason is absolutely the wrong guy to play that role. Like, I love James Mason. I call him Orson Welles' like dandy little brother. But wrong energy. I think he tends to take himself a little too seriously in movies, and I think Rupert, you need to be like we saying. He's got to be a charming snake.
I think
You can't.
Mason would have made a great Black Michael, though.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think he would.
that's
Yeah.
what he should have done.
Michael.
He would have been. He would have brought that Disney's Captain Nemo energy, and I think it would have been great. By the way, on the Fairbanks note, just because I love this so much, obviously Douglas Fairbanks Jr., son of Douglas Fairbanks, one of the great actors of all time. Fairbanks Jr. reportedly wanted to play Rudolph in the film, and they gave it to Coleman and went, well, you could be Rupert. And he was not happy about that, didn't want to do it. And the quote is, Douglas Fairbanks, his father, told him, not only is The Prisoner of Zenda one of the best romances written in 100 years and always a success, but Rupert of Hentzau is probably one of the best villains ever written.
Mm.
And as I said to Tom, I do think that quote, as it's reported today, might be a little massaged, because it makes it sound very noble, and I have to imagine that if you're Douglas Fairbanks, who I don't think ever got to play this role, but I'm sure you want to, and your son gets offered Rupert of Hentzau, I imagine it's said less poetically and much more grabbing him by the shoulders and going, you idiot, if you don't take this role, this is one of the best. I would kill to be offered this role. I'm too old to do. I would kill to do this. Don't you dare pass this up because you're not the lead. I promise you, people are going to remember you the most out of this movie. And it's true.
Yeah.
No disrespect to Ronald Coleman, but Douglas Fairbanks is the one who, when you watch this movie, you're like, oh, that's a star, you know.
Well, it's just, I mean, just even like if you like take it, like hover above the story, or like the story they're adapting as the movie, like you're looking at the screenplay. Rupert is the character. You know, like Philip was saying, the hero's always reactive, and we see it now in like, you know, whatever superhero movies or whatever. Yet if your superhero movie, the superhero's the more interesting character, you're kind of fucked up because you need the guy. Rupert is the guy. And it's also just smart casting because he doesn't look like everybody else in the movie. It's very pointed that he's kind of almost like a self-made asshole, where all of these other guys, it's kind of this incestuous nation. They all look the same. It's, you know, they're marrying their cousin and all of this stuff. And then you got this blonde, blue-eyed, just sleek dickhead just strolling in, just being like, yeah, I'm better than all of you idiots. I just don't have the title.
Well,
but I'm going to have fun fucking with all of you.
And also think about the fact that, like, beyond that, like, this whole thing is, in terms of what's going on with Rudolph and with the king and with Flavia, there's a lot of politicking and a lot of manners, right? And Flavia even choosing her duty over the person she loves. And yet, Rupert has a line in the film that I love when he essentially just goes, well, I knew two twin sisters that were, oh, well, that's another story. Like, that he's just...
that one blew my hair back.
Right? Because this is post-code, too. Like, this is...
Oh, yeah.
But that's kind of the thing that I do kind of love, is that Rupert, as much as he's, you know, working for the king or anything like that, he also represents something outside of this old system, a system that... When the novel was written, you know, as you said, Philip, you know, the beginning of modernity, now we're in 1937, right? Like, you know, it's easy to romanticize Ruritania when you're watching it, which, you know, we'll talk about this before we wrap. The art direction is incredible in this movie.
Gorgeous movie.
But you also, in 37, are watching this and essentially by now going, the Ruperts win, right? Like, you're watching it going, like, at some point, like, this is gone. It doesn't matter if Black Michael wins or the king is rightfully crowned or anything like that. Looking at these countries and the countries that Ruritania is supposed to be, or, you know, supposed to be similar to, like, we're in 1937. This is if there is still a king in power in 37 in Ruritania, odds are does not have the power that they're all fighting over. And I think that makes it more romantic. Now, with last thing I want to say when I said the art direction, I want to make sure we touch on this and talking about the things that it's influenced. I you know, Philip, you're a fantasy man. Are you much of a science fiction guy?
Yeah, I'm more fantasy than science fiction, but I did actually write a book for children about science fiction called Write Your Own Sci-Fi, which is available in America. And but
So do you know perhaps the most significant science fiction influence that Prisoner of Zenda has had?
let me think. I couldn't say actually. No, what would?
Because I love the look of this film. I said to Tom when I was watching it, like, weirdly, you do feel like everything is authentically Ruritanian, which is not a thing anything can be, but you feel it because when they were going to redesign the uniforms for Star Trek for the big screen, the uniforms you see them wear in Wrath of Khan and so forth, those very kind of real, specifically referencing the Ruritanian costumes in this
That's
version of
interesting.
Prisoner of Zenda.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting for a couple reasons. One, I just love the idea that this film and the look of this film had such an impact that when it came to like, well, we need to make these costumes better for the big screen. We need to make them more cinematic. That's what you go to. But also the idea of when you think about it, the Ruritanian romance kind of has died off by the mid-century because, well, we've now seen all these countries, and quite frankly, in America, we've shot at a lot of these countries. But we'll get into that another time. But that Star Trek and science fiction starts to occupy that because what does that become? Well, you go out to other planets, and you can
Yeah.
have other forms of government and other romantic adventures in space. So I think the fact that the look of 37 Zenda and just Prisoner Zenda in general still factors into like it's in the DNA of science fiction adventures as well. I think
You've
it's
just
cool.
reminded me of one of my favorite scenes in science fiction films, which is the Dune adaptation, the 1982
Mhm.
Dune,
The David
Dune
Lynch one, yeah.
Duke Leto Atreides is about to go off to the planet, to the spice planet, and then the family sort of stands there in their uniforms, and then there's this enormous ship with a gilded sort of thing around the door, and it's like a Ruritanian royal family transported into this extraordinary galactic world. So yeah, I can see that.
Khan is a very Rupert-esque
Yes.
character,
Yeah, that too.
and you watch Meyer's Star Trek movies or just his other movies, or you read his books or whatever. Guarantee, like, it's not a surprise that he would use Zenda as a point of reference for anything. He's very much got that old kind of spirit to him, and yeah,
Well, and
I think that's great.
I think that, I talked about my love as a kid of like the old swashbuckling adventures, or even from literary standpoint, something that my dad used to call, I don't know what the proper term is. Sometimes I see it called like schoolboy adventures. My dad would refer to them on occasion as ripping yarns, specifically because of, I
Yes.
think it was Michael Palin or one of them. One of the former Pythons had like a show that parodied all of those schoolboy adventures. I forget which one now. One of them. Someone will yell at me in our review section on iTunes. Sure. But any event. But I always loved those, and I feel like, and that's why as a kid I was always a fan of like the older Disney movies, whether it's the Davy Crockett's or the Treasure Island, because I kind of love that energy of. We talked about how dark Prisoner of Zenda can get, but no matter how
Mhm.
dark it gets, those schoolboy adventure novels would have darkness. People would die.
Mhm.
Shit would get bad. Even the Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn books,
Mhm.
people would die. Shit would get bad, but it was still with the idea of like, hey, come take the ride, right? Come
Yeah.
enjoy this ride. That Anthony Hope novel is great because there is, other than, as we talked about, the framing device where he's like, I was laying on the couch. Once he
Yeah.
gets on that train, that novel really does move like a rocket. Like you
Yeah.
can't, it is, it sounds cliche, but it is a page turner. You
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
can see how, when it came out, people were staying up to finish the next chapter or see where the next thing went. And I think that, we get that here and there now. I saw the re-release of Pirates of the Caribbean recently for the 20th anniversary, which made me feel old. And it did. I kind of enjoyed that too, just kind of going like, right, for a brief moment, Hollywood went, you guys just want to watch a fun adventure film for
Yes.
2 hours? You want some drama, you want some romance, you want to laugh and cry and have a good time. And
Yeah.
it's amazing too how well this film from 37 still
Yeah.
plays and still
Yeah.
grips,
Absolutely. I would very much agree. It's a bit like the Scarlet Pimpernel. I don't know if you've ever read that
Yes,
one.
yeah, yeah.
It's Baroness Orksky, which has a similar kind of pull, and it's got the same kind of absolutely gripping. Again, it's someone who pretends to be somebody else all the way through, which is it's a sort of common theme. But yeah, I agree. I think a lot of films now do forget that their primary purpose is to entertain.
Well, that's something I talk about on the show a lot, which is that everyone forgets that, movies were invented as an entertainment device. Yeah. Like, yes, you can make art out of it, and, it's not to say entertainment can't be art, but, like, sometimes you gotta remind yourself, like, just enjoy the fucking movie. Just sometimes you just want to go to a movie on Friday night with the guys or your girlfriend or whatever, and just be like, I don't know, let's watch Patrick Wilson get hunted by a ghost. Like, I don't know, like, it doesn't have to be anything crazier, or like, oh, we're gonna reach into your soul and touch you and get to a deeper meaning. I'm like, no, I just want to see Keanu Reeves fall down a mile of stairs.
But then even so, like, something like this can be so entertaining, and yet when you get to that ending,
no, that's not to say you, like I said, that's not to say these things can't be art, but sometimes people tend to put the art ahead of the entertainment when they can coexist at the same time. And like you said, this is kind of the perfect example of that. There are deeper things in here about politics, about love and responsibility and all of that stuff. But at the same time, you could also just you could watch it hungover and just be like, shit, that was just fun.
Yeah,
like
it's
like it's just kind of like the perfect kind of example.
Young Steven Spielberg absolutely saw this on television as a kid.
Yeah.
And because there's Indiana Jones in this. There's so much in this.
Oh shit! There's Empire Strikes Back in this. The Vader Luke fight in Empire Strikes Back. I was watching this sword fight in this. I'm like, oh shit! George Lucas definitely saw this goddamn movie. Not to mention Lando, like you mentioned to me in a text.
Yeah.
If Rupert didn't if he just flipped a coin and was like, all right, I'll be a good guy now.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens in the next movie. Yeah, I mean, it's nice, we talked about this format of ours forces us to watch stuff that's not always on the top 100 movies ever made lists or whatever. It's nice sometimes after watching a documentary and a short film or an experimental thing, something heavy, to just be like, oh fuck, guys fighting with swords. This one guy, oh, they're coming at me with a gun. I'm just gonna throw a table at them, and they're gonna be surprised. I don't know. It's just nice to just sit back and watch. Oh, okay, this is fun. This is entertaining. I don't need to be fucking oh god, I gotta watch a movie about the human condition. No, guy gets impaled with a sword. It's a nice Saturday night for me, in my opinion. More swords and more impalements. That's what I say. Enough of this fucking superhero shit and the upcoming Mattelverse. Let's get some swords. Let's bring the swords back, guys. Enough of this shit.
I agree.
I don't know. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done with the bit.
Did anybody, Philip? Did you have anything else you wanted to say about Zenda and 37 before we kind of wind down talking about the Oscars that year and such?
I don't think so. Just that I was reminded so much of that lovely duel between Wesley and Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride, but Wesley is playing the Hensau character because at the time he's the Dread Pirate Roberts, so he's got this kind of lovely insouciance and kind of a slightly acerbic charm, which is just lovely. But yeah, sorry, go on the Oscars.
Just before the Oscars, I just feel like if I don't mention this movie in context of this episode, but we mentioned the horror aspect and how there's even visual cues. It looks like an old Universal horror movie, and Philip's talking about the doubles. That was a very popular trope in the era this was written. The book was. There's no way Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was not something that was in their minds. Not especially with the story they're telling, and just 6 years earlier,
the Frederick March
movie wins. Yeah, the Frederick March movie wins an acting Oscar for that story. So like, there's no way that like, even if it was subconsciously, just like, all right, we're telling a story about doubles and all of that. We got this like gothic horror look in some of the sets. Let's, I guess, let's kind of like think about that for a bit.
I will say one little nugget of trivia before I talk Oscars, which is I forgot to note this during the scene, a great scene where the orchestra keeps stopping whenever they stop dancing. The orchestra conductor, who has to keep stopping, is played by Al Sheen, uncle of the Marx Brothers. So that's there. That's fun. Now, as we always do, Tom, wrapping up, how do you think 1937's The Prisoner of Zenda fared at the Academy Awards that year?
Ooh, that is tough. I'm going to be very cynical and say they fucked up, and I'm going to say 0 nominations.
You would be incorrect.
Okay, my cynicism fails me again.
It didn't get nearly as many as I would argue it should, because I've sat through a lot of these that I think are lesser, but, I'm not going to be that guy. But we have actually talked about this Oscar a year before. It was not nominated for Best Picture. The nominees that year were The Awful Truth, Captains Courageous, Dead End, The Good Earth, In Old Chicago, Lost Horizon, 100 Men and a Girl, Stage Door, A Star is Born, and the winner, The Life of Emile Zola. The reason we've talked about this year before, Tom, is this is also the year of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So you want to talk lavish fantasies. Now, it was nominated for 2 Oscars. It was nominated for Best Score, which it lost to 100 Men and a Girl. And then the one I think is even more egregious, it was nominated for Best Art Direction and lost to Lost Horizon, which I think is fascinating because Lost Horizon, obviously, like, you had art directors trying to visualize Shangri-La, and at the same competing against art directors trying to visualize Ruritania, which I think is really interesting. But those are the 2 nominations that it got. Lost both. I think that's egregious. Especially the scoring one too, because I don't remember the score of 100 Men and a Girl. How
does Fairbanks not like Heath Ledger this shit?
Right?
Like, how does he not best support? Like, that's nonsense. Like, boo. I say boo.
I think I don't remember the name of the actor. Supporting actor that year, I think, goes to whoever was in The Life of Emile Zola, which is weird because they don't give it to Paul Muni for Life of Emile Zola, because it goes to Captains Courageous, Spencer Tracy. Captains Courageous, which of course, as we all recall, is the basis for the classic film Cabin Boy, which no one remembers Cabin Boy, just me, right? Chris Elliott comedy from the 90s. David Letterman's in it. No, nothing. Okay.
Nope.
But anyway,
I was going to say it's my favorite cereal.
That's how it fared at the Oscars. Philip, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and coming on with us 2 schmoes and taking time out of your day to discuss with us. I hope we haven't embarrassed ourselves, and also I hope we haven't embarrassed all of America in this.
No, you've comported yourselves very well.
So,
I appreciate you lying to me. That's fine.
As we,
but no, really, this was great. Thank you so much.
So at the end here, do you have what would you like to plug? Be it books, social media, anything you want to plug for our listeners or encourage them, please.
I do have a book out now called Wild Lord, which is out in America, and the sequel is out in January or February next year. So it will be hitting your shores then. Great. And it's a kind of teen fantasy set in England, obviously, about a girl who discovers an evil ghost in her house, because that's what happens in England.
As we said before we started recording, every building in your country is haunted. Just a fact. It's just how it works.
Well, that's why the most honest movie of the 21st century thus far is The Conjuring 2.
Yes.
Just England's just that haunted. Got to send the Warrens.
There it goes. Did you have any socials you want to plug? Any websites? Anything like that you want to show?
I think I have a Twitter account, but it's not very interesting, so I wouldn't bother with it.
Well, I mean, that's a shame.
Excuse me, sir. You have an X account.
Yeah. Twitter's doing great right now.
I have an X account.
Excuse us. We don't want to get attacked by the incel community. It is now X, because none of them are having sex.
Well, Philip, Thank you so much for
It's a
joining us.
pleasure.
Really appreciate it. You're welcome back anytime if you have any interest in the other titles. Everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and me, who can submit their nominations for the registry in the form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of every episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. The only criteria? It must be an American film that's at least 10 years old. Here are today's picks.
Well, I'm not going to do any real preamble here. It's kind of an obvious pick it's The Man Who Would Be King, Michael Caine, Sean Connery, a John Huston picture. It's a movie about two fucking guys pretending to be royalty. I mean, really, like, where did I get this pick from? How did Tom make this pick again? Oh, Tom's magical math coming into work yet again. Him and his brain. But, I mean, it's a great movie. Huston's last great movie, I think. Maybe the best Michael Caine's ever been in a movie. Maybe the best Sean Connery's been in a movie. It's gorgeous, old school epic, but with the John Huston flavor. It's a great movie. And, it would be an interesting counterpoint to this in like a double feature. So my pick is The Man Who Would Be King.
It's fitting that Tom does a whole little bit at the start of his registry pick, making fun of how often he picks something that's kind of needs a lot of thinking and is tangentially attached. And he's the one picking kind of a straightforward one-to-one because I'm going a little out of left field. I think it's a case of, as I'm sure is discussed, as we discussed in the episode, one of the biggest cultural legacies of this film that is still around, that is still discussed, it's the incredible art direction, it's the incredible set design, it's the incredible costume design. Because, as is often noted, the costumes worn by the characters in Ruritania, the costumes for the Star Trek film, particularly Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And once you've seen Prisoner of Zenda, you can't not see it in those uniforms for Starfleet. And I think that in the same way that The Prisoner of Zenda was kind of an escapist fantasy for its time, the legacy of Star Trek is also one that, like, it has this following. It has inspired the same way that somebody like a Philip Womack or so on, fantasy writers were so influenced by the Ruritanian romances. So many sci-fi writers and even scientific thinkers are influenced by Star Trek. So I do think that Star Trek needs some representation in the registry. In general, needs some representation preserved in our culture. Wrath of Khan, obviously the best of the Star Trek films, but the fact that it is so closely connected to Prisoner of Zenda that this 1937 film goes on to influence the look of cinematic Trek when they decided, well, we need Star Trek to be more impressive and more austere on the big screen. They turned to Zenda, I think is so impressive. So I believe Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, should absolutely be in the National Film Registry for a million reasons on its own, and also for how it is a great example of how one genre of film and one type of film can influence.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Thank you again to Philip Womack for joining us. Next week, we're hitching a camel through the Arabian desert with an old friend. Returning guest Vice Victus is back for the 1962 epic Lawrence of Arabia. Don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.